We're getting back to work on the 3B, and today we're going through and completely rebuilding the steering system. I have new tie rods, tie rod ends, rebuild the drag links, new bearings for the belt crank, and new bearings and seals for the steering box. So let's jump right into it and get all of this installed on the Jeep. So the first thing we're going to do is install new bearings in the belt crank. Now the way the steering is set up on this Jeep, the steering box is actually pushing forward and backwards. So what the belt crank does is changes that forward and backwards motion to left and right motion for the steering. So we have a new bolt and bearings, and then there's a little sleeve in there as well. So what we need to do, and I can see some witness marks from the old bearings. The bearings are on either side, and there's obviously a grease fitting that will fill the inside. So we need to take these seals off and the bearings off, and then try and either push or tap them in from each side, and then we'll get it installed in the Jeep. Alright, so obviously tapping the bearings in with a hammer did not work, so we went over to the press and got them pressed in. The good thing is the sleeve still fits, still smooth going through, so we know they're straight and square in there. Now, you saw me use a larger socket to press them in the first time, and then this taped socket to press them in a little bit deeper. And then I put tape on the socket that's at the same distance for the seal, because the seals need to go in here, and then everything will get sandwiched together. So we'll go ahead, I'll put some grease in here, get it all put together, and then we can get it bolted to the Jeep. So now that we have the belt crank installed, we can go through and remove this temporary wooden tie rod. So I put this on just to make it easier to move the front axle and Jeep around before getting all the steering together. So the next thing we're going to do is rebuild the tie rods. Now initially I was thinking I would just get tie rod ends, but then after looking at this tie rod and then looking online and realizing that should be straight, I just replaced everything. So we'll just start new, all new tie rods, all new tie rod ends. So we're going to go through, we'll get the ends on, we'll try and get them at least in line with these old ones. Obviously they're bent, they're not going to be right on, but at least gives us a ballpark to getting it set up. So now that the tie rods are on and at least snugged in place, we're going to go through, take the drag link off the steering box, and start tearing into the steering box. So now that we have the steering box all disassembled, that grease oil slop at least wiped down, not all fully cleaned up. So going through and inspecting the parts, I found something I really didn't want to find. And that's the sector shaft is twisted. And I'll do a close-up on it, but the splines are no longer straight. So I don't know what happened to cause these splines. The Jeep had factory tires, factory setup, so I don't know if driving it got wedged between a rock or some really bad bump steer that caused this damage. So what I thought was just going to be a simple rebuild, maybe a little more involved. And it's unfortunate too because these pins or these points on the end, they hardly show any wear. And that's what obviously what we would have wanted, and it would have made the steering really tight. So we have to replace this sector shaft. Now I've heard from some Willys guys that they don't like the aftermarket or replacement sector shafts because they're prone to breaking or failing, which obviously is not what you want. So if this breaks, then you have no steering at all. So what we do have, that chassis that I brought in here to steal the 11-inch drum brakes from, that has a steering box on it. So I'm going to go, we'll jump outside, see how easily we can get the box off or get that sector shaft out of that box, take a look at it. Do we just use that box or do I just steal that sector shaft and use this box and all the other components? So time for a field trip. Alright, so here's that chassis and here's the steering box. But this box, at least that outside cover, looks quite a bit different. And looking at where the sector shaft is, obviously it goes all the way through the frame, so that's quite a bit longer. So I'm actually not going to be able to steal this box or sector shaft from this because it's a forward control. So this steering box is obviously not going to work, and the other two frames and vehicles are obviously forward controls as well. So it turns out I don't have something I can steal off of here. So plan C. Alright, so what is plan C? Well, obviously plan A would have been to use the original sector shaft, but I don't want to do that. Maybe if it was a less critical component, we might use it, but I don't want to be driving and have that fail. So I'm not going to use that. So obviously plan B with a forward control sector shaft is out of the picture. So now I got to see if I can find an original box or sector shaft that I can put in this, or do some more research on the aftermarket ones and how big of a risk it is to run those. So I guess for right now, we're going to shift gears away from the steering. There's obviously still plenty to do, which is what we'll do now. So let's take a look. So I have a full pile of painted parts up. We got drive shafts, yokes, the e-brake, everything with that, transfer case shifters, bump stops. So there's obviously still plenty to do. So the only thing to do now is cue the montage. So the pile of painted parts has now been replaced by a mess of tools. The only thing that I didn't get in was the clutch linkage, and that's just because I didn't have the bolting to bolt that to the frame. So that's still one thing we'll have to follow up on. Obviously this video didn't go initially as planned, but we still got quite a bit done. The drive shaft's in, parking brake all in, transfer case shifters all in, and the bump stops in. And we did make good progress even on the front of the steering, getting all the tie rods and everything in. So the only thing is, how long is it going to take for me to get a replacement sector shaft? For the meantime, I have the rest of the steering in the parts washer to try and get that thick oil grease off. We'll let that sit this week and then come back and clean that up. Alright, so I'm going to get the garage cleaned up and start hunting down a new sector shaft for this. Thank you for taking the time and watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.